A man stood before Parliament in 1775 and did something that should have destroyed his career. He defended the American rebels, not with careful hedging or political calculation, but with a speech so powerful that it still echoes through history. His colleagues thought he was insane. The king wanted him silenced. Yet Edmund Burke kept talking, and in doing so, he invented modern conservatism, shaped the idea of political parties, and helped define what it means to be a statesman rather than just a politician. But here's what nobody tells you about Burke. He wasn't supposed to matter at all. Born in Dublin on January 12, 1729, Edmund Burke entered a world that had already decided his fate. His father, Richard Burke, was an attorney practicing in a city where Catholics couldn't own land, couldn't vote, and couldn't hold public office. His mother, Mary Nagle, came from a Catholic family that had watched their ancestral lands stripped away by English law. The Burke household existed in that strange twilight zone of 18th century Ireland, officially Protestant, but surrounded by Catholic relatives, legally secure but socially marginal. The details of his early childhood are frustratingly sparse. We know he was sickly. We know he was sent to live with his mother's family in County Cork for several years, supposedly for his health. What we don't know is what this did to a child's mind, being shuttled between two worlds, two versions of Christianity, two ways of understanding power and its absence. His father wanted him to be a lawyer. Of course he did. Richard Burke had clawed his way into the Irish legal establishment, and he intended his son to climb higher. Young Edmund showed promise. He read voraciously. He wrote constantly. He had that dangerous combination of intelligence and imagination that makes parents simultaneously proud and worried. In 1744, at 15, Burke entered Trinity College, Dublin. The university was designed to produce Protestant gentlemen who would serve the English crown in Ireland. It succeeded brilliantly at this, which is precisely why Burke's time there matters so much. He wasn't just learning law and classics. He was learning how power works, how it justifies itself, how it creates systems that seem natural and inevitable. He excelled at Trinity, founded a debating club, won prizes for his essays, made friends who would matter later, including a young man named William Dennis, who would become his constant companion. But something else was happening too. Burke was reading everything he could find about philosophy, history, and human nature. He was particularly drawn to writers who questioned established certainties, who poked at the foundations of received wisdom. After graduating in 1748, Burke moved to London to study law at Middle Temple. His father had won, or so it seemed. London in 1748 was the largest city in Europe, a place of extraordinary contrasts. Coffee houses buzzed with political debate. Theatres packed audiences for plays that would have been banned a generation earlier. The British Empire was expanding rapidly, bringing wealth flooding into the capital. But Burke noticed the other side too. The poverty, the public hangings that drew crowds like sporting events, the casual cruelty that seemed woven into the fabric of prosperity. He was supposed to be studying law. Instead, he was haunting bookshops and attending lectures on subjects that had nothing to do with legal precedent. His notebooks from this period reveal a mind pulling in every direction at once. Notes on Cicero sit beside observations about street vendors. Philosophical fragments interrupt draft legal briefs. By 1750, it was clear Burke wasn't going to be a lawyer. His father was furious. The correspondence between them during this period shows Richard Burke trying every tactic. Anger, disappointment, financial pressure. None of it worked. Edmund had discovered something more compelling than a legal career. He wanted to write. This decision should have been catastrophic. He had no income, no prospects, no family wealth to fall back on. Writing in the 18th century wasn't a profession. It was a gamble. Most writers lived in garrets, churning out hackwork for publishers who paid by the page and cared nothing for quality. Dr. Johnson, the great literary figure of the age, had nearly starved during his early years in London. But Burke had a plan. He would write something that would make his reputation in one stroke, something ambitious enough to attract attention, but practical enough to find readers. In 1756, he published his first book. It was called A Vindication of Natural Society, and it was one of the strangest debuts in literary history. The book pretended to be a posthumous work by Viscount Bolingbroke, a famous philosopher who had recently died. In Bolingbroke's voice, Burke constructed an elaborate argument that all forms of government were oppressive and that humanity would be better off in a state of nature. The twist, it was a satire. Burke was mocking the philosophical radicals who thought society could be perfected through reason alone. He was showing how their arguments, taken to their logical conclusion, led to absurdity. The problem was that his satire was too good. Many readers took it seriously. Some were outraged, others were inspired. Burke had to write a preface to the second edition, explaining that no, he didn't actually believe civilization was a mistake. The book sold well enough to establish him as a serious writer. More importantly, it announced what would become Burke's lifelong project: defending the messy, complicated, imperfect reality of human institutions against the seductive clarity of abstract theories. That same year, 1756, Burke published his second book, and this one wasn't satire. A philosophical enquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful was an attempt to understand aesthetic experience through careful observation and reasoning. Why do certain things move us? What's the difference between beauty, which attracts us, and the sublime, which overwhelms us? The book was genuinely original. Burke argued that our aesthetic responses aren't arbitrary preferences but have roots in our biology and psychology. The sublime, he suggested, comes from our encounter with things that could destroy us, but don't. Vast spaces, great heights, overwhelming power held in check. Beauty, by contrast, offers us proportion, delicacy, smallness, things we can comprehend and protect. This might seem like abstract philosophy, but Burke was doing something revolutionary. He was taking human experience seriously, on its own terms, not trying to force it into predetermined categories. This approach, this respect for the complexity of actual human life, would define everything he later wrote about politics. The book made his reputation. Suddenly, Edmund Burke was someone who mattered in London's intellectual circles. He received invitations to dinners, to clubs, to gatherings where the most interesting minds of the age argued about everything under the sun. He met David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher. He became friends with Joshua Reynolds, the portrait painter. He joined Samuel Johnson's famous literary club. But Burke had a problem. Books about aesthetics don't pay the rent. He needed steady income, and that meant finding a patron. In 1758, Burke accepted a position as private secretary to William Gerard Hamilton, an Irish MP who was about to become Chief Secretary for Ireland. The job came with a decent salary and seemed like it might lead somewhere. Burke spent the next several years helping Hamilton navigate Irish politics, drafting speeches, managing correspondence, learning the machinery of government from the inside. He also got married. In 1757, he had met Jane Mary Nugent, the daughter of an Irish Catholic physician. We know almost nothing about their courtship, which is frustrating because their marriage would become one of the most important relationships in Burke's life. Jane was intelligent, capable, and fiercely loyal. She would manage their household, raise their children, and serve as Burke's closest advisor for nearly 40 years. They married in 1757 and had 2 sons, though only one, Richard, survived to adulthood. The family rented a house in London and tried to maintain the appearance of genteel prosperity, while Burke scrambled to earn enough to keep them afloat. The Hamilton position should have been perfect. It gave Burke access to power, a regular income, and time to continue his literary work. But Hamilton turned out to be a disaster as an employer. He was jealous of Burke's obvious talents. He kept promising advancement that never materialised. Worst of all, he tried to bind Burke to him through a secret agreement that would have made Burke his permanent assistant, unable to take other positions without Hamilton's permission. In 1765, after 7 years of frustration, Burke broke with Hamilton. It was a huge risk. He was now 36 years old, with no steady income, a family to support, and a reputation as a brilliant writer who couldn't seem to turn his talents into a sustainable career. Then something extraordinary happened. The Marquis of Rockingham, one of the great Whig aristocrats, offered Burke a position as his private secretary. More than that, he offered to help Burke enter Parliament. This was the opportunity Burke had been waiting for. Rockingham wasn't just any aristocrat. He was about to become Prime Minister, and he needed intelligent men around him who could think strategically about the political challenges facing Britain. The American colonies were growing restless. King George III was asserting royal prerogatives that Parliament thought it had settled 50 years earlier. The old political certainties were breaking down. Rockingham saw in Burke exactly what he needed: someone who could write, who could think, who understood how ideas shaped politics. Burke saw in Rockingham something equally valuable: a man of principle who wanted to use power wisely, not just to accumulate more of it. In December 1765, Edmund Burke entered the House of Commons as MP for Wendover, a pocket borough controlled by Lord Fermaner. He was 36 years old, and he had finally found his calling, but he had no idea what he was walking into. The House of Commons in 1765 was not the democratic institution we imagine today. Most seats were controlled by aristocrats who could essentially appoint whoever they wanted. Debates were not reported in newspapers. The public had no real way of knowing what their representatives were doing. Corruption was so endemic that it seemed like just another part of the system. Burke's first speech was a disaster. He was nervous, over-prepared, too formal. MPS dozed or chatted through his carefully crafted arguments. He sat down feeling like he'd humiliated himself, but he learned. He watched the great speakers, figured out what worked, adapted his style. Within months, he was delivering speeches that commanded attention, and he needed that skill immediately because the Rockingham administration faced a crisis that would define Burke's entire career. The American colonies were in revolt against the Stamp Act, a tax that Parliament had imposed without colonial consent. Violence was breaking out. British officials were being tarred and feathered. The empire itself seemed at risk. Most MPS wanted to crush the rebellion with force. Some wanted to double down on parliamentary authority. Burke, along with Rockingham, took a different position. Yes, Parliament had the legal right to tax the colonies, but was it wise to exercise that right? Was it prudent to push confrontation when compromise was possible? In early 1766, Burke helped craft the strategy that would repeal the Stamp Act, while passing a declaratory act asserting Parliament's theoretical right to legislate for the colonies. It was a masterpiece of political manoeuvring, satisfying everyone just enough to prevent disaster, while satisfying no one completely. This would become Burke's signature move, finding the practical solution that preserved what mattered while avoiding ideological purity. He was already thinking in terms that would later define his political philosophy: prudence over principle, prescription over theory, the wisdom embedded in existing institutions over the allure of rational reform. The Rockingham ministry fell in July 1766, lasting barely a year, but Burke had established himself. He was now recognised as one of the most formidable speakers in Parliament and one of the shrewdest political minds of his generation. He also discovered something about himself during this period. He loved politics, not the shallow game of advancement and favour trading, but the deeper work of shaping how people thought about power, justice, and the common good. He had found his subject, and that subject would consume the rest of his life. Burke spent the next 9 years in opposition as the political situation deteriorated. The American crisis worsened, new ministries came and went, the king grew more assertive, and Burke watched it all, speaking, writing, building the intellectual framework that would make him the most important political thinker of his age. The crisis Burke watched unfold wasn't just political, it was philosophical, a question that cut to the heart of everything he believed about how society should function. What happens when theory collides with reality? The men driving British policy toward America were rationalists. They believed in abstract principles, in the logical rights of Parliament, in the systematic application of power. If Parliament had the right to tax the colonies, then Parliament should tax the colonies. The principle demanded it. Anything less was weakness. Burke saw the madness in this immediately. He stood in the Commons in 1774 and delivered what would become one of his most famous speeches on American taxation. The chamber was packed. MPs, who usually ignored colonial debates, showed up because Burke was speaking. He had that kind of reputation now. His argument was simple, but devastating. Yes, Parliament had the legal right to tax America, but rights are not duties. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. The question isn't what's theoretically correct, it's what actually works. The colonies had governed themselves for a century and a half. They had their own assemblies, their own traditions, their own sense of how things should be done. This wasn't rebellion, this was prescription. The accumulated wisdom of generations. The habits that had proven themselves through practice. Trying to impose a new system on top of that, no matter how logically sound, was like trying to transplant a heart into a body that would reject it. But nobody was listening. Not really. The theoretical argument was too seductive. Parliament is supreme. Parliament has rights. Therefore, Parliament must assert those rights. The logic was airtight. The policy was catastrophic. Burke watched in mounting frustration as ministry after ministry pursued the same failed approach. Tax the colonies? They resist. Send troops? They resist harder. Impose more restrictions? They organise. It was a spiral toward disaster, and everyone could see it happening. But the gravitational pull of abstract principle was too strong. In 1775, Burke tried again, on conciliation with America. Another massive speech, meticulously researched, passionately delivered. He laid out the entire history of the relationship between Britain and the colonies. He showed how the current crisis was the inevitable result of trying to force theoretical consistency onto a complex reality. He proposed a solution: grant the colonies the right to tax themselves, preserve the forms of parliamentary supremacy while conceding the substance, let them have self-government in practice while maintaining the legal fiction of imperial control. It was brilliant, it was practical, it was ignored, the vote wasn't even close. Burke's motion was defeated by more than 2-1. 6 weeks later, fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. This failure haunted Burke for the rest of his life, not because his ego was bruised, but because he had seen so clearly what was coming and been powerless to prevent it. The empire was tearing itself apart over a question of principle that could have been avoided with a little prudence. But something else was happening during these years, something that would prove even more significant for Burke's intellectual development. He was working out his theory of representation. What does it mean to represent people in Parliament? Most MPs assumed the answer was obvious. You speak for your constituents, you voice their opinions, you're their agent, their delegate, their mouthpiece. Burke rejected this completely. In 1774, he was elected MP for Bristol, one of the few constituencies where voters actually had some power. At his victory speech, he told them something they did not want to hear. He would not be their delegate, he would be their representative. And there was a difference. Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. And he betrays instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. This was radical. Burke was saying that once elected, an MP's duty was to his own conscience and his understanding of the national interest, not to the specific wishes of the people who elected him. Parliament was not a congress of ambassadors. It was a deliberative assembly of one nation, with one interest, that of the whole. The Bristol voters were furious. They expected their MP to do what they told him. Burke was telling them he'd do what he thought was right instead. It cost him the seat eventually, but he never backed down from the principle, because this idea connected to something deeper in his thought. Society is not a contract between living individuals that can be rewritten whenever someone has a better theory. It's a partnership between the dead, the living, and the unborn. The wisdom of the past has claims on us. The needs of the future have claims on us. We're not free to remake everything according to our current preferences. The representative's job is to balance all of these claims, to draw on tradition and prescription, to consider consequences that extend beyond the next election, to resist the momentary passions of the crowd while still respecting their fundamental interests. It's a difficult balance. Burke knew that, but he thought it was essential. While Burke was developing these ideas about representation and prudence, his personal life was reaching a kind of equilibrium. He had married Jane Nugent back in 1757, before his literary career had really taken off. She was the daughter of an Irish physician, intelligent and devoted. By all accounts, it was a happy marriage, though the Burkes never had much money. They lived at a country estate called Gregory's, later renamed Beaconsfield, about 30 miles from London. Burke loved the place. It was his refuge from the chaos of politics, a physical embodiment of the rooted, traditional life he valued intellectually. He farmed the land badly. He was terrible at managing money. He accumulated debts that would plague him for decades. But he was happy there, in a way he never was in London. His son Richard was born in 1758, the only one of his children to survive infancy. Burke doted on him. Perhaps excessively, Richard would grow up to be his father's secretary, assistant, and eventually his greatest grief. But that tragedy lay years in the future. For now, in the 1770s, Burke had achieved something resembling stability. He had a seat in Parliament, a reputation as a great speaker, a growing body of published work, a loving family, and a place to call home. He was still poor by the standards of his aristocratic friends. He still worried about money constantly, but he had found his place in the world. And then everything started falling apart. The American War went from bad to catastrophic. British armies surrendered. The French entered the war on the rebel side. The empire was being humiliated, and the political class seemed incapable of learning anything from the disaster. Burke watched friends die, careers collapse, the entire structure of British politics convulse. The king became more assertive, trying to govern directly through loyal ministers rather than accepting the constitutional limitations that Burke thought essential. This was dangerous, not because George III was a tyrant exactly, but because he was trying to exercise powers that had fallen into disuse. He was reaching back to old prerogatives that existed in theory but had been abandoned in practice. And Burke, the defender of prescription, found himself in an odd position. He was defending the relatively recent conventions of the 18th century against the older theoretical powers of the 17th. It was a perfect example of how his thought worked. Prescription doesn't mean defending the oldest thing. It means defending what has proven itself through sustained practice. The constitutional settlement after 1688 had worked for nearly a century. It had produced stability, prosperity, and freedom. That success gave it legitimacy. Going back to an older model, no matter how theoretically justified, was destructive innovation. Burke articulated this in a series of speeches and pamphlets, attacking what he called the king's secret influence. He argued that George III was subverting the constitution not by breaking laws, but by using patronage and corruption to pack Parliament with loyalists who would vote however he wanted. It was a constitutional crisis conducted through entirely legal means. And that made it harder to fight. You couldn't point to any specific law being broken. You had to argue that the spirit of the Constitution was being violated, even while its letter was being observed. Most people couldn't follow this argument. It was too subtle, too dependent on understanding how informal conventions and formal rules interact. But Burke kept making it, year after year, building the case that British liberty was in danger not from foreign enemies, but from the corruption of its own institutions. By 1780, things had reached a breaking point. The American war was clearly lost. The economy was staggering under the cost. Political opposition was fragmenting. Burke's party, the Rockingham Whigs, was in disarray. And then something unexpected happened: the Gordon Riots. In June 1780, a mob of Protestant extremists rampaged through London, burning Catholic chapels, attacking foreign embassies, destroying property. For a week, the city was in chaos. The authorities seemed paralysed. Nobody knew if this was the beginning of a revolution or just an outbreak of religious mania. Burke's house was attacked. He had to flee with Jane and Richard to safety. He watched London burn and wondered if England was about to descend into the same kind of civil strife that had torn it apart in the 17th century. The riots were eventually suppressed. Hundreds were killed. The ringleaders were hanged. Order was restored. But something had shifted in Burke's mind. He had seen how quickly civilization could collapse, how thin the veneer of order really was, how easily a mob could overwhelm institutions that seemed solid. This would matter later. In 1789, when news arrived from France of another mob, another attack, another revolution, Burke would remember London in 1780, and he would react very differently than most of his friends. But that was still years away. For now, in 1782, Burke finally got what he'd been seeking for 16 years. The Rockingham Whigs returned to power, and Burke, at age 52, became paymaster of the forces, a cabinet-level position that finally gave him real influence over policy. He immediately set about trying to reform the system. His target was corruption, the vast network of patronage and sinecures that allowed the king and his ministers to buy loyalty. Burke proposed eliminating hundreds of useless offices, cutting the civil list, reducing the opportunities for bribery disguised as legitimate government employment. This was deeply personal for Burke. He had spent his career watching mediocrities rise through corruption while talented men were ignored. He had seen how patronage distorted politics, how it made MPs answerable to ministers instead of constituents, how it allowed the executive to dominate the legislature. His reform bills passed, but in weakened form. He eliminated some offices, reduced some expenditures, but nothing like the comprehensive overhaul he had envisioned. The system was too entrenched. Too many people benefited from it. Even his own party was divided, and then after just 3 months, Rockingham died, suddenly, unexpectedly. The government collapsed. Burke was out of office again. It had been a brief taste of power, and it left him frustrated. He had accomplished something, but nothing like what was needed. The system continued to rot. The American War had finally ended, but only after complete defeat. The empire had been permanently diminished, and the lessons that should have been learned were already being forgotten. Burke spent the next few years in what felt like political wilderness. He wrote, he spoke, he maintained his seat in Parliament, but the energy was gone, the sense of purpose. He was in his mid-50s now, and he must have wondered if his career was essentially over. He had achieved fame as a speaker and writer. He had articulated a political philosophy that was coherent and sophisticated. He had fought for causes he believed in. But had he actually changed anything? Had all those speeches and pamphlets made any real difference? The answer would come from an unexpected direction, not from Parliament or party politics, but from India, from a scandal involving a company, a governor, and the systematic plunder of an entire subcontinent. Burke was about to discover a cause that would consume the next 14 years of his life, a cause that would test everything he believed about justice, power, and the responsibilities of empire, a cause that would make him more enemies than everything else he had done combined. The East India Company was not supposed to be a government. It was a trading company, chartered by the Crown in 1600 to import spices, textiles, and tea from Asia. But by the 1770s, it had become something else entirely. It ruled Bengal, one of the richest regions in India, with a population of 20 million people. It collected taxes, maintained armies, dispensed justice, waged wars. It was a corporation that had accidentally conquered an empire, and it was looting that empire systematically. The mechanism was elegant in its corruption. Company officials were paid tiny salaries, but given vast opportunities for private trade and extortion. A young man would arrive in India as a clerk earning £50 per year. Within a decade, if he survived the climate and disease, he might return to England worth £100,000 or more. Not through his salary, through what they politely called perquisites. These perquisites included forcing Indian merchants to sell at artificially low prices and buy at artificially high ones, accepting presents from local rulers who needed the company's protection or favour, taking cuts from tax collection, monopolising trade in essential goods. The entire system ran on what was essentially legalised theft, and the victims were the people of Bengal. Burke had been aware of Indian affairs for years. He had friends who had served there. He had read the reports that filtered back to London, the accounts of famines and misrule. But it was not until 1781 that he became fully engaged with the issue. The catalyst was a man named Warren Hastings. Hastings had been Governor-General of Bengal since 1773, the most powerful British official in India. He was intelligent, capable, and by the standards of his position, relatively honest. He did not personally engage in the worst forms of extortion. He tried to stabilise the company's rule, to make it more systematic and less chaotic, but he also defended the system itself. He believed that British rule in India was legitimate, that it brought order to what had been anarchy, and that the methods used to maintain that rule were justified by necessity. When subordinates committed atrocities, he protected them. When critics raised questions, he dismissed them. When the company's actions caused famines that killed millions, he treated it as an unfortunate side effect of necessary policy. Burke came to see Hastings as the personification of everything wrong with British rule in India, not because Hastings was uniquely evil. That was almost the point. Hastings was intelligent and cultured, a man who appreciated Indian languages and customs. He was exactly the kind of person the establishment respected, and that made him more dangerous than a simple villain. The campaign began quietly. Burke started asking questions in Parliament about specific incidents, a war against the Marathas that seemed unnecessary, the treatment of the Begums of Oudh, elderly women whose treasures had been confiscated, the execution of Nunkumar, an Indian official who had accused Hastings of corruption. Each case revealed a pattern: British power exercised without accountability, Indian lives and property treated as disposable, justice perverted to protect British interests. The more Burke investigated, the angrier he became. This was not abstract philosophy anymore. This was real suffering inflicted on real people by a system that Burke's own country had created and maintained. The East India Company operated under a charter granted by Parliament. Its actions were taken in Britain's name. That meant Britain was responsible. Burke threw himself into the cause with an intensity that surprised even his friends. He spent hours reading documents, correspondence, reports from India. He interviewed former company officials, Indian merchants, anyone who had direct knowledge of what was happening. He built a case methodically, brick by brick. His allies thought he was obsessed. His enemies thought he was mad. Why was he spending so much energy on events happening thousands of miles away? Why did he care so much about people he had never met? There were plenty of problems in Britain itself that needed attention, but Burke could not let it go. He saw in India the same pattern he had seen in Ireland and America. Power without restraint, exploitation justified by supposed necessity. Human beings treated as means rather than ends. The same fundamental injustice, just on a larger scale. In 1783, Burke introduced legislation to reform the company's governance. The bill proposed taking political control of India away from the company and placing it under a board appointed by Parliament. It was a radical proposal, and it went nowhere. The company had too many friends in Parliament, too much money to spread around, too much influence, but Burke had put the issue on the agenda. He had forced Parliament to confront what was being done in India, and he was not finished. The turning point came in 1785 when Hastings returned to England. After 12 years in India, he came home expecting honour and reward. Instead, he found himself accused of high crimes and misdemeanours. Burke was preparing to impeach him. Impeachment was an ancient parliamentary procedure, rarely used. It allowed the House of Commons to bring charges against officials whom the normal legal system could not touch. The Commons would act as prosecutor, presenting evidence. The House of Lords would act as judge and jury. It was designed for cases where ordinary law was inadequate. Burke spent 2 years building his case. He identified specific charges, each supported by documentary evidence: corruption, extortion, starting unjust wars, violating treaties, oppressing the people of India. The list was long and detailed. On February 13th, 1786, Burke rose in the House of Commons to open the impeachment proceedings. He spoke for 4 hours. It was one of the most powerful speeches of his career, and it laid out not just the charges against Hastings, but a complete theory of imperial responsibility. Britain, Burke argued, had not conquered India by right. It had acquired power there through a combination of military force and commercial manipulation. That power came with obligations. The British were not entitled to rule Indians for British benefit. They were trustees, responsible for the welfare of the people under their control. When company officials abused that trust, when they used their power to enrich themselves at Indian expense, when they treated Indians as less than human, they violated not just law, but fundamental morality. And they did so in Britain's name, making Britain complicit in their crimes. This was Burke at his most radical. He was arguing that British power in India was legitimate only if exercised for Indian benefit, that Indians had rights that British officials were bound to respect, that cultural difference did not excuse oppression. These ideas were not common in 18th century Britain. Most people assumed that conquered peoples existed to serve their conquerors. That was how empires worked. Burke was proposing something different, a kind of empire bound by moral law where power created responsibility rather than license. It was visionary and probably impossible, but Burke believed it or wanted to believe it. The Commons voted to impeach. The trial would begin in Westminster Hall in February 1788. The impeachment of Warren Hastings became the sensation of the age. Westminster Hall was packed for the opening. Peers in their robes, members of the Commons, foreign ambassadors, and anyone who could get a ticket, even the royal family attended. This was political theatre on the grandest scale. Burke opened the prosecution on February 13th. He spoke for 4 days, detailing the charges, describing the suffering of the Indian people, attacking not just Hastings, but the entire system he represented. His speeches were published and read across Europe. He became famous not just in Britain, but internationally as the man who dared to challenge empire itself. The trial dragged on for 7 years, 7 years of testimony, evidence, legal arguments. The Lords met irregularly, sometimes going months between sessions. Hastings defended himself ably, arguing that everything he had done was necessary, that Burke did not understand the realities of governing India, that easy moral judgments from London ignored the complexities on the ground. He was not entirely wrong. Burke had never been to India. He was working from documents and testimony, constructing his understanding secondhand. Some of his charges were stronger than others, some of his evidence was questionable, and Hastings had genuinely faced difficult situations where every option was bad. But Burke was not primarily interested in the details of administration. He was interested in principles. He wanted to establish that British officials in India were accountable, that they could not hide behind necessity or distance, that their actions would be judged by moral standards, not just pragmatic ones. The trial consumed Burke's life. He spent hours preparing for each session, coordinating with the other prosecutors, refining arguments. He neglected his other parliamentary duties. He exhausted himself. Friends worried about his health, and slowly it became clear that he was losing. The Lords were not convinced. Hastings was one of their own, a man who had served the empire loyally. The charges seemed excessive. Burke's passion seemed disproportionate. The whole thing felt like persecution rather than justice. In April 1795, after 7 years, the House of Lords voted. On every charge, Hastings was acquitted. Burke had lost completely. He was devastated. 14 years of work, from his first questions in 1781 to the final verdict in 1795. Thousands of hours of research, dozens of speeches, a trial that had consumed his energy and damaged his health. All for nothing. Hastings went free, his reputation damaged but his liberty intact. The East India Company continued its rule in India, largely unreformed. The abuses that Burke had documented continued, in some cases worsened. Nothing had changed. Or had it? Burke had lost the trial, but he had won something else. He had put the question of imperial responsibility on the public agenda. He had forced Britain to confront what was being done in its name. He had articulated principles that would echo through later debates about colonialism and human rights. The impeachment failed, but the ideas survived. Later reformers would build on what Burke had started. The company's rule would eventually end, replaced by direct British government control, which brought its own problems, but at least acknowledged some responsibility for Indian welfare. The moral arguments Burke made would be cited by critics of empire for generations. But Burke did not live to see any of that. And even if he had, it would have been cold comfort. He had wanted justice for the people of Bengal. He had wanted accountability for Hastings and the system he represented. He had gotten neither. The defeat left him bitter and exhausted. He was 66 years old when the verdict came down. His health was failing. His political career was essentially over. He had spent 14 years on a cause that had consumed him, and he had nothing to show for it. Except he was wrong about that. He had something profound to show for it, even if he could not see it. He had demonstrated that principle mattered more than pragmatism, that justice was worth pursuing even when victory was impossible, that some fights were worth having even if you lost. Burke had always believed that politics was about more than power. It was about right and wrong, about defending the vulnerable, about holding the powerful accountable. The Hastings impeachment was the fullest expression of that belief. It was Burke at his most idealistic and most frustrated, his greatest effort and his most complete failure. But while Burke was fighting his losing battle over India, something else was happening. Something that would divide him from many of his allies and define his final years. Something that would make the India campaign look modest by comparison. News was arriving from France of revolution, of a monarchy overthrown, of radical new ideas about liberty and equality spreading across Europe. And Edmund Burke, the man who had defended American rebels, who had championed reform, who had spent decades criticizing arbitrary power, was about to shock everyone by becoming the revolution's most eloquent enemy. On July 14th, 1789, a mob stormed the Bastille prison in Paris. The French Revolution had begun, and Edmund Burke watched with growing horror. Most of his political allies were thrilled. Charles James Fox called it the greatest event in world history. The poet William Wordsworth wrote that to be alive in that dawn was bliss itself. Across Britain, reformers celebrated. France, the great enemy, the absolute monarchy that had threatened British liberty for centuries, was finally throwing off its chains. Surely Burke, champion of American independence, defender of religious minorities, critic of arbitrary power, would rejoice too. He did not. Within weeks of the Bastille's fall, Burke was warning that this revolution was different, that something terrible was unfolding, that the old order in France, for all its faults, was being replaced not with liberty, but with chaos and tyranny. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. The break came in public on February 9th, 1790. Burke was in the House of Commons, speaking on army estimates. Somehow, the debate turned to France. Fox began praising the revolution, celebrating the overthrow of despotism. Burke interrupted. His voice was sharp, emotional. He launched into an attack on the French revolutionaries, calling them violent fanatics who were destroying a legitimate government. Fox tried to calm him. This was their old disagreement about political philosophy, nothing to get heated about. They debated these things for years. But Burke wasn't having it. He said their friendship was over. Fox, stunned, tried to protest. Burke cut him off. He said he knew the price of what he was doing, that he'd rather lose Fox than his principles. The House fell silent. These two men had been political partners for over 20 years. They'd fought together on America, on India, on a dozen other causes, and now Burke was ending it, in public, over a revolution happening in another country. Fox left the chamber in tears. Burke continued his speech, growing more passionate. He was beginning to articulate what would become his most famous work, though he didn't know it yet. Something about the French Revolution had triggered a reaction in him that went beyond normal political disagreement. He saw it as an assault on everything that made society possible. What was it that horrified Burke so much? After all, he'd defended American revolutionaries. He'd spent years attacking the British establishment over India. He'd championed reform his entire career. Why was France different? The answer lay in Burke's deepest political convictions, the ones he'd been developing for 30 years. Burke believed society was organic, not mechanical. It was something that grew slowly over generations, accumulating wisdom through experience. Institutions like monarchy, aristocracy, and church were not arbitrary impositions. They were evolved solutions to human problems, tested by time, refined through trial and error. You could reform them, yes. You should reform them when they became corrupt. But you could not simply tear them down and start over from abstract principles. The French revolutionaries believed the opposite. They thought society was a machine that could be disassembled and rebuilt according to rational design. They believed in the rights of man, in liberty, equality, fraternity. Universal principles derived from pure reason. They would remake France, remake humanity itself, according to these principles. Whatever stood in the way, tradition, religion, aristocracy, would be swept aside. Burke saw this as madness. Human beings were not raw material to be moulded by philosophers. Society was not a machine to be redesigned. The revolutionaries were like children playing with fire, destroying a complex system they did not understand in pursuit of abstract ideals that could never be realized. The result would not be utopia, it would be blood. And he was going to say so. In November 1790, Burke published Reflections on the Revolution in France. It was officially addressed to a young French correspondent who'd asked Burke's opinion. But really, it was addressed to Britain, to Europe, to anyone who would listen. The book appeared at exactly the moment when enthusiasm for the revolution was at its height. Most observers still saw events in France as a triumph of liberty. The violence had been minimal so far. The revolutionaries spoke in the language of Enlightenment reason. Surely this was progress. Burke's book detonated like a bomb. It was not a careful academic analysis. It was a passionate, angry, eloquent assault on everything the revolution represented. Burke predicted disaster. He said the revolution would end in military dictatorship. He said the revolutionaries' abstract principles would lead to concrete atrocities. He said France was descending into chaos and that chaos would eventually threaten all of Europe. The book was over 300 pages of argument, history, philosophy, and prophecy. Parts of it were brilliant, parts were hysterical, all of it was urgent. Burke wrote as a man trying to warn his civilization about an approaching catastrophe that only he could see. His most famous passage described an event from October 1789. Revolutionary women had marched to Versailles and forced the royal family to return to Paris. Burke had heard about the incident from a French acquaintance. He'd been told that the Queen, Marie Antoinette, had fled through the palace in her nightgown, while the mob broke through her guards. Burke used this scene to crystallize everything he found horrifying about the revolution. He recalled seeing Marie Antoinette at Versailles 16 years earlier, when he'd visited France as a young man. She'd been the Austrian princess, recently married to the French crown prince, glittering and beautiful. Burke described her as she appeared then, surrounded by splendor, destined for greatness. He wrote that he thought surely she would be honored for years to come, that 10,000 swords would leap from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But instead, he wrote, she'd lived to see disasters fall upon her. She'd been forced to flee from assassins in the middle of the night, while the palace echoed with the screams of murdered guards. The age of chivalry was dead, Burke declared. It had been succeeded by an age of sophists, economists, and calculators. The glory of Europe was extinguished forever. It was magnificent prose. It was also somewhat misleading. Marie Antoinette had not actually been in nearly as much danger as Burke suggested. The incident, while frightening, had not involved assassins or murdered guards in her chambers. Burke was dramatising, using the scene to make a larger point about the revolution's character. His critics pounced on the exaggeration. They accused him of caring more about the Queen's dignity than about the suffering of French peasants who'd starved under the old regime. Thomas Paine, Burke's former ally, wrote a devastating reply called Rights of Man. Paine said Burke pitied the plumage, but forgot the dying bird. He said Burke was mourning for a privileged aristocrat while ignoring the millions who'd been oppressed by the system she represented. The revolution was necessary because the old order was rotten. The violence was regrettable, but temporary. France was building something new and better. The debate exploded across Britain. Burke's book sold over 30,000 copies in its first year, an enormous number. It went through multiple editions and was translated into French, German, Italian. Everyone was reading it, arguing about it, taking sides. The revolution had become Britain's defining political question, and Burke had become its most eloquent opponent. His predictions seemed insane at first. Military dictatorship. France had just established a constitutional monarchy. Atrocities? The worst violence had been the storming of the Bastille, and that had killed fewer than 100 people. Burke was seeing phantoms, his critics said. The man had finally gone too far. But then events in France began to move in exactly the direction Burke had warned about. The constitutional monarchy collapsed. The revolutionaries grew more radical. In August 1792, the Parisian mob stormed the Tuileries Palace. The king was arrested. In September, over 1,000 prisoners were massacred in Paris jails, butchered by crowds who suspected them of counter-revolutionary sympathies. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine. His queen followed in October. The terror began. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, instituted a dictatorship. They executed aristocrats, priests, suspected moderates, eventually each other. The guillotine worked constantly. Rivers of blood, Burke had said. He'd been right. The Vindication brought Burke no joy. He was 73 years old now, sick, exhausted, watching his worst predictions come true. He'd lost most of his political allies over his opposition to the revolution. Fox and the progressive Whigs had broken with him completely. They still supported France, even as the terror raged. Burke was increasingly isolated, his warnings validated, but his warnings having changed nothing. In 1794, his son Richard died. Richard had been Burke's closest companion, his political heir, the person who would have carried on his work. He was 43 years old when a sudden illness took him. Burke was shattered. Jane, his wife, was broken by grief. Burke himself seemed to age overnight. The man who had been so vigorous, so energetic, so consumed by public affairs, suddenly looked old and frail. But he kept writing. He kept warning. He published letters on a regicide peace, arguing against any negotiation with revolutionary France. He said you could not negotiate with ideology, with men who believed they were remaking humanity. You could only defeat them or be defeated by them. Most British politicians ignored him. They wanted peace. The war with France was expensive and going badly. Surely some accommodation could be reached. Burke said no. He said this was not a normal war between nations over territory or trade. This was a war of ideas, of civilizations. The French revolutionaries wanted to export their revolution, to overthrow every throne, every church, every traditional institution in Europe. They would not stop until they were stopped. Any peace would be temporary, a breathing space before the next assault. He was right about that too, though again, he would not live to see it. In 1799, 4 years after Burke's death, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in France. The revolution had ended in military dictatorship, exactly as Burke had predicted. Napoleon would spend the next 15 years trying to conquer Europe, spreading revolutionary principles at bayonet point, fulfilling Burke's prophecy about the revolution's aggressive character. But Burke died before Napoleon's rise. His final years were spent in his house at Beaconsfield, the estate he'd purchased during his more prosperous days. He was in pain, probably from stomach cancer, though the doctors of the time could not diagnose it properly. He wrote when he could, received visitors when his health permitted, and watched from a distance as the European order he'd spent his life defending crumbled. On July 9, 1797, Edmund Burke died. He was 67 years old. His last words were reportedly about his son. He was buried in Beaconsfield, in the church where Richard was buried. Jane survived him by 15 years, living quietly at the estate, sustained by friends and by a pension the government had finally granted Burke in his last years. The obituaries were respectful, but mixed. Burke had been a major political figure for 3 decades. He'd been involved in every significant debate of his era, but he'd also ended his career estranged from many former allies, obsessed with the French Revolution, increasingly bitter and isolated. Some remembered him as a brilliant orator and political philosopher. Others remembered him as a man who'd lost his balance in old age, who'd betrayed progressive principles to side with reactionaries. The judgments would shift with time. In the 19th century, as Europe struggled with the aftermath of revolution and Napoleon, Burke's reputation rose. Conservatives claimed him as their founding philosopher. He'd seen what the others had missed. He'd understood that stability and tradition mattered, that societies could not be remade overnight according to abstract principles, that revolution was dangerous precisely because it was unpredictable. But what had Burke actually believed? Was he a conservative, defending the status quo against all change? That seemed wrong. This was the man who championed American independence, who'd fought for decades to reform British imperialism in India, who'd defended Irish Catholics and religious minorities. He'd spent most of his career attacking the British establishment. The answer was more subtle. Burke believed in reform, but not revolution. He thought societies should evolve, adapting to new circumstances while preserving what worked. He trusted gradual improvement over radical transformation. He believed tradition carried wisdom that should be respected, even if it also carried injustice that should be corrected. Progress was possible, even necessary, but it had to be careful, rooted in experience, mindful of consequences. This made Burke difficult to categorize. He wasn't a reactionary who opposed all change, but he wasn't a progressive who welcomed change regardless of cost. He was something else, something harder to define. A reformer who feared revolution, a champion of liberty who defended tradition, a critic of power who worried about anarchy. His legacy would be claimed by different movements at different times. Conservatives would cite his warnings about revolution. Liberals would cite his defense of American colonists and Indian subjects. Pragmatists would cite his skepticism of abstract theory. Each would find something genuine in Burke, because he'd contained contradictions that he never fully resolved. His books told a different story than his politics. The Reflections on the Revolution in France was published in November 1790, and it changed everything. Not immediately. The first reactions were hostile. Burke's former allies felt betrayed. Thomas Paine, who'd been his friend, wrote Rights of Man specifically to refute him. Mary Wollstonecraft published a scathing response. The radical societies that had celebrated the fall of the Bastille saw Burke as a turncoat, an aristocratic apologist who'd revealed his true reactionary nature. But the book kept selling. It went through 11 editions in the first year. Translations appeared in French, German, Italian. People who'd never heard Burke speak in Parliament were reading his warnings about revolutionary violence, his defence of inherited institutions, his arguments about the dangers of abstract political theory untethered from experience. And as the revolution in France grew more radical, as the September massacres occurred, as the guillotine became the instrument of political terror, Burke's prophecies seemed increasingly prescient. He'd predicted this. He'd seen it coming when others were still celebrating liberation. The book's influence grew year by year, long after Burke was dead. It became the founding text of modern conservatism, though Burke himself would have been uncomfortable with that label. He'd never systematized his thinking into an ideology. His political philosophy emerged from specific situations, from concrete problems that needed solving. He distrusted grand theories, whether revolutionary or conservative. What made the Reflections powerful was not its systematic argument, but its rhetorical force. Burke wrote with passion, with imagery, with emotional appeal. The famous passage about Marie Antoinette, which his critics mocked as melodramatic, captured something his more analytical opponents missed. He understood that politics wasn't just about rational calculation. It was about sentiment, loyalty, attachment to place and tradition. These things mattered to ordinary people, even if philosophers dismissed them as irrational. His other major work, Reflections on the Present Discontents, written 20 years earlier, had made a different but related argument. The problem with British politics wasn't the constitutional structure. The problem was party discipline had broken down. Ministers served the king rather than representing coherent political principles. The solution was organised parties that would offer voters clear alternatives and hold their members accountable. This was radical thinking. In 1770, most politicians viewed parties as factions, as sources of corruption and instability. Burke argued they were necessary for responsible government. Parties created continuity. They preserved institutional memory. They made politics about more than individual ambition. This idea shaped British politics for the next 2 centuries. The party system that emerged in the 19th century, with its clear divisions between government and opposition, its collective responsibility, its emphasis on manifesto commitments, all of this traced back to Burke's defence of party in the 1770s. Yet he'd written it not as abstract theory, but as a response to specific problems in George III's reign. His speeches revealed the same pattern. The greatest speeches, the ones on America, on India, on economic reform, weren't theoretical treatises. They were responses to immediate crises. Burke didn't start with principles and deduce conclusions. He started with situations and worked backwards to the principles that might help address them. This made him frustrating to later thinkers who wanted a systematic Burke philosophy. There wasn't one. Or rather, the philosophy was embedded in the responses to particular cases, and you had to extract it carefully, recognizing that Burke himself might have adjusted his thinking if the circumstances had been different. His approach to Ireland illustrated this. Burke was Irish, born in Dublin, raised in a family with Catholic connections, even though his father had conformed to the Anglican Church. He understood Irish grievances from the inside. The penal laws that restricted Catholic rights weren't just unjust in abstract terms. They were stupid, counterproductive, creating exactly the resentment and instability they were supposed to prevent. For decades, Burke pushed for Catholic relief. He wanted the penal laws repealed, Catholic emancipation granted, the Irish Parliament given real power. This put him at odds with most of the British political establishment, which viewed Irish Catholics as a security threat and Irish independence as unthinkable. Burke argued that denying rights created threats, that giving Catholics a stake in the system would make them loyal, that Ireland could be kept in the British orbit through justice rather than coercion. He was ignored. The British government made small concessions under pressure, but refused fundamental reform. The result, as Burke had predicted, was the Irish Rebellion of 1798, which occurred the year after his death. The rebellion was suppressed with brutal efficiency, and the British response was to abolish the Irish Parliament entirely, incorporating Ireland directly into a united kingdom. This was exactly the opposite of what Burke had advocated. He'd wanted Ireland to have more autonomy, not less. He'd wanted reconciliation through reform, not suppression through force. His thinking about empire followed similar lines. The problem with British rule in India wasn't that Indians were being governed by foreigners. The problem was they were being governed badly, exploited by a commercial company that had no legitimate authority and no concern for their welfare. Burke didn't oppose British power in India. He opposed its abuse. The impeachment of Warren Hastings consumed 7 years of Burke's life. Hastings had been Governor-General of Bengal, the most powerful British official in India. He'd enriched himself and his associates through methods Burke considered corrupt and brutal. The trial before the House of Lords lasted from 1788 to 1795. Burke made the opening speech, which lasted 4 days. He brought witnesses from India, presented mountains of evidence, argued that Hastings had violated every principle of justice and humanity. Hastings was acquitted. The Lords decided that while his methods had been irregular, they were justified by circumstances. India was different from England. Different rules applied. Burke's response was that no circumstances justified tyranny, that power created obligations regardless of where it was exercised, that Indians deserved the same protections under law as Englishmen. This was a radical position for the 1790s. Most British politicians viewed empire as a simple matter of profit and power. Burke insisted it carried moral responsibilities. The trial bankrupted him. He'd spent his own money funding the prosecution, believing the principles at stake justified any cost. When Hastings was acquitted, Burke had nothing to show for 7 years of effort except debts and the knowledge that he'd failed. But the arguments he'd made during those years established principles that later reformers would build on. The idea that imperial rule must be accountable, that colonial subjects have rights, that power must be exercised for the benefit of the governed, these became part of the British imperial ideology in the 19th century, even if the practice often fell short. His economic writings were less celebrated, but equally influential. In Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, written in 1795, during a period of high food prices and popular unrest, Burke argued against government intervention in grain markets. "Let prices rise," he said. "High prices would encourage production and importation. Government price controls would only make shortages worse. The poor would suffer in the short term, but interference would make them suffer more in the long term. This seems harsh, and Burke's critics said so at the time. But he wasn't being callous. He genuinely believed that markets worked better than government planning, that the invisible hand of supply and demand was more reliable than the visible hand of state intervention. He was wrong about some things. His faith in market mechanisms was too absolute. But his arguments influenced later economic thought, particularly the classical liberal tradition that dominated the 19th century. What unified all these positions? What was the thread connecting Burke's defense of American colonists, his opposition to the French Revolution, his campaign against Hastings, his support for Catholic relief, his economic liberalism? It wasn't a simple left-right divide. Burke didn't fit neatly into modern categories. The pattern was his emphasis on prescription, things that had existed for a long time, that had evolved through experience, that had proven themselves in practice. These deserved respect, not blind obedience. Burke was perfectly willing to reform prescriptive institutions when they'd become corrupt or outdated, but the burden of proof lay with those who wanted change. Tradition was innocent until proven guilty. This was different from both revolutionary radicalism and reactionary conservatism. The radicals wanted to sweep away the old order and build something new, according to rational principles. Burke thought this was dangerous because the old order contained accumulated wisdom that rationalists couldn't see. The reactionaries wanted to preserve everything exactly as it was. Burke thought this was impossible because societies had to adapt to survive. His position was that change should be organic, gradual, rooted in existing institutions rather than imposed from outside. Reform from within rather than revolution from without. Evolution rather than replacement. This made him suspicious of sudden transformations, whether they came from radical revolutionaries or autocratic monarchs. Both violated the principle that legitimate change had to grow naturally from a society's own traditions. The French Revolution was horrifying to Burke precisely because it rejected this approach. The revolutionaries didn't reform the monarchy, they abolished it. They didn't modify traditional institutions, they destroyed them and created new ones based on abstract theories. They didn't evolve the social order, they tried to reconstruct it from first principles, and the result, as Burke predicted, was chaos, violence, and eventually dictatorship. But Burke's own life contradicted some of his philosophy. He'd risen from modest circumstances through talent and effort. He'd made his career by challenging the established order, by attacking the East India Company, by defending American rebels, by pushing for reforms that the British elite opposed. How could a man whose entire career was built on challenging tradition become the great defender of tradition? The answer was that Burke distinguished between legitimate and illegitimate authority. Tradition was valuable when it represented accumulated wisdom, when it had proven itself through time, when it served human needs. But tradition could also be corrupt, oppressive, blind. The East India Company's rule in India was traditional in the sense that it had existed for decades. But it wasn't legitimate because it violated basic principles of justice. The British government's treatment of American colonists was traditional in the sense that it followed established patterns of imperial control, but it wasn't legitimate because it denied colonists their rights as Englishmen. Burke's test was whether institutions served human flourishing. If they did, they deserved preservation. If they didn't, they needed reform. But reform had to respect what worked while fixing what didn't. You couldn't burn down the house to fix a broken window. His personal relationships showed this tension. He maintained friendships across political divides, even as his own positions hardened. Charles James Fox remained his friend long after their political break, though they rarely spoke in Burke's final years. Richard Sheridan, the playwright and politician who'd worked with Burke on the Hastings impeachment, drifted away as Burke became more conservative. But Burke's affection for individuals often survived his political disagreements with them. His marriage to Jane was the one constant in his life. She managed the household, dealt with creditors when money was tight, hosted the dinners that were central to Burke's political networking, and provided emotional support through his many disappointments. They never had biological children who survived infancy. Richard had been their surrogate son, and his death broke something in both of them. Jane's letters after Richard's death show a woman trying to hold together a grieving husband while managing her own grief. The estate at Beaconsfield represented Burke's aspirations and his vulnerabilities. He'd bought it in 1768, when his career was rising and money seemed plentiful. It was a gentleman's property, the kind of place a successful politician ought to own, but he'd never been able to afford it comfortably. The estate was always draining resources, always needing repairs, always threatening to pull him under financially. He refused to give it up because doing so would have meant admitting failure, acknowledging that he wasn't really a gentleman, that his rise had been an illusion. This pride was very human. Burke had spent his life among aristocrats, arguing as their equal, expecting to be treated as their peer, but he'd never forgotten that he was Irish, middle class, dependent on political success for his income. The estate was proof that he belonged. Losing it would have confirmed every doubt his enemies had ever expressed about his legitimacy. By 1795, Burke knew he was dying. His health had been failing for years, but now the decline was unmistakable. He suffered from stomach pains that left him doubled over, unable to eat, barely able to sleep. The doctors had no real answers. This was the 18th century. Medical science could describe suffering, but rarely cure it. He continued writing because he couldn't stop. His last major work, published in 1796, was called Letters on a Regicide Peace. The title tells you everything about his state of mind. Britain was negotiating with France, considering a treaty that would recognise the revolutionary government. Burke was horrified. You don't make peace with regicides. You don't treat the murderers of a king as legitimate rulers. You don't negotiate with evil. The letters are furious, passionate, sometimes incoherent with rage. Burke saw the French Revolution as an ongoing crime, not a historical event that had ended. The terror might have concluded, the guillotine might have stopped, but the principles that had produced the terror remained in power. Those principles would produce more violence, more chaos, more destruction. Making peace with France meant accepting those principles, legitimising them, allowing them to spread. His colleagues in Parliament thought he'd lost perspective. Yes, the revolution had been terrible. Yes, the terror had been horrific, but France was exhausted. The revolutionary fervour had burned itself out, and Britain needed peace. The war was expensive, unpopular, seemingly endless. Wasn't it time to recognise reality and negotiate? Burke disagreed with every fibre of his being. This wasn't about practical politics. This was about the future of civilization. If revolutionary France survived, if its government was treated as legitimate, then the ideas that had animated the revolution would survive too. Other nations would look at France and think that perhaps revolution wasn't so bad. that perhaps tradition could be discarded, that perhaps societies could be remade according to abstract principles. He was right, though he wouldn't live to see it. Within a decade, Napoleon would crown himself emperor and march across Europe, spreading revolutionary principles at the point of a bayonet. The wars that Burke feared would consume a generation. The old order would be shattered beyond repair. The world of 1815 would be unrecognisable to someone from 1789. But Burke's warnings fell on deaf ears in 1796. He was yesterday's man, yesterday's crisis, yesterday's fears. The younger generation of politicians had moved on. They respected Burke's legacy, acknowledged his brilliance, but thought his obsession with France had become unhealthy. He was the old warrior who couldn't accept that the battle was over. His isolation was nearly complete. Fox wouldn't speak to him. Sheridan had drifted away. The younger Whigs, who might have been his political heirs, had rejected his analysis of France. He still had friends, still had admirers, but his influence was gone. The letters on regicide peace sold poorly. The public wasn't interested. Burke withdrew to Beaconsfield. The estate that had been his pride now became his refuge. He couldn't walk far, couldn't ride anymore, could barely make it from his bedroom to his study. Jane watched him fade, helpless to stop the decline. The doctors came and went, prescribing useless remedies, offering empty reassurances. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, some to old friends, some to political allies, some to strangers who'd written to him. He wanted to be remembered correctly. He wanted people to understand what he'd been trying to say. He wanted his analysis of the revolution to survive, even if he didn't. One of his last letters went to a young French émigré who'd written asking for advice. Burke told him to preserve the memory of pre-revolutionary France, to remember what had been destroyed, to teach his children about the world that the revolution had swept away. Tradition wasn't just old customs, it was the accumulated wisdom of generations, the tested solutions to permanent problems, the inherited knowledge that made civilization possible. The pain grew worse. Burke could barely eat. He spent his days in bed, surrounded by books he could no longer read, papers he could no longer write on. The doctors increased the laudanum, trying to give him some relief. It helped a little, but not enough. He died on July 9th, 1797, at Beaconsfield, with Jane beside him. He was 68 years old. The funeral was private, as he'd requested. He was buried in the local church, not in Westminster Abbey, where his enemies had feared he'd demand a state funeral. He'd wanted no fuss, no political theatre, no opportunity for either side to claim him. The obituaries were respectful but brief. Burke had been out of power for years. His death was news, but not major news. The papers acknowledged his brilliance, his rhetorical gifts, his long service to the nation. They mentioned the impeachment of Hastings, his support for American independence, his writings on France. Then they moved on to other topics. Within a decade, he was mostly forgotten by the public. The generation that had known him personally aged and died. The political battles he'd fought were superseded by new conflicts. The French Revolution was ancient history, replaced by Napoleon's wars and then by the peace that followed Waterloo. But Burke's ideas survived. They survived because they addressed permanent questions rather than temporary crises. How much change is safe? How do we reform institutions without destroying them? What's the relationship between tradition and progress? When is revolution justified? When is it catastrophic? The 19th century conservatives who built parties and movements across Europe drew on Burke whether they knew it or not. The idea that society was an organic whole, that reform had to respect existing institutions, that abstract theories were dangerous when applied to complex realities, these became the foundation of conservative political thought. Britain's gradual reform in the 19th century, the way it extended voting rights without revolution, The way it adapted to industrialization without social collapse followed Burke's model. Change was necessary, but it had to be careful, incremental, tested against experience. You didn't burn down institutions, you reformed them. The Americans who'd once been Burke's allies also claimed him. His speeches defending the colonies were reprinted throughout the 19th century. He became an American hero, the Englishman who'd understood American liberty better than most Americans. The fact that he'd later opposed the French Revolution was conveniently forgotten or reinterpreted as wisdom rather than contradiction. Even some liberals adopted Burke. John Stuart Mill, the great 19th century philosopher of liberty, admired Burke's practical wisdom even while disagreeing with his politics. Mill thought Burke was wrong about France, but right about the importance of testing theories against reality, right about the dangers of abstract systems. The 20th century brought new appreciation for Burke's warnings. After the Russian Revolution, after the rise of fascism, after the disasters of utopian politics, Burke's critique of revolutionary ideology seemed prophetic. He'd predicted that revolutions based on abstract principles would produce tyranny. He'd warned that destroying traditional institutions would create chaos. He'd argued that human nature couldn't be remade through political force. Writers like Russell Kirk in America and Michael Oakeshott in Britain built sophisticated conservative philosophies on Burke's foundation. They argued that the modern world's problems came from forgetting Burke's lessons, from believing that reason alone could solve political problems, from thinking that societies could be engineered like machines. Others disagreed. The left saw Burke as the defender of privilege, the man who'd opposed necessary change because it threatened the powerful. His defence of the British Constitution looked like defence of aristocratic power. His attack on the French Revolution looked like fear of democracy. His warnings about abstract principles looked like excuses for maintaining injustice. This debate continues. Every time a revolution succeeds or fails, people argue about whether Burke was right. Every time a reform movement faces resistance, both sides claim Burke's authority. He's become a kind of political Rorschach test. People see in him what they want to see. But certain things about Burke are simply true, regardless of one's politics. He was a brilliant writer. His speeches and essays remain models of political rhetoric, combining philosophical depth with emotional power. Students still study his work to learn how to write persuasively, how to construct arguments that work both logically and emotionally. He understood that politics is about more than policies. It's about communities, traditions, relationships. You can't reduce it to abstract principles or mathematical calculations. Human societies are complex systems that have evolved over generations. They contain wisdom we don't fully understand. Changing them requires care. He recognized the importance of prescription, the idea that long usage creates legitimacy. A tradition that has survived for centuries probably serves some purpose, even if we can't articulate exactly what that purpose is. This doesn't mean traditions can never change. It means we should understand them before we discard them. He saw that reform and revolution are different. Reform works within existing institutions, modifying them gradually, testing changes against reality. Revolution destroys institutions and tries to build new ones from scratch. The difference isn't just tactical. It reflects different understandings of how societies work, different levels of confidence in human reason, different attitudes toward the past. His greatest insight was about the limits of human knowledge. We don't understand society well enough to redesign it. We can make improvements, fix obvious problems, adapt to changing circumstances. But we can't start over. We can't wipe the slate clean. The complexity exceeds our comprehension. This humility before complexity is Burke's most important legacy. In an age that believes every problem has a solution, every question has an answer, every challenge can be met through proper planning, Burke reminds us that some things are beyond our control. Some knowledge is embedded in traditions we don't fully understand. Some wisdom is inherited rather than invented. The estate at Beaconsfield survived him. Jane lived there until her death in 1812. Then it passed to distant relatives and eventually left the family entirely. Today, it's privately owned, not open to the public. There's a small memorial in the local church where Burke is buried, but most visitors to the area don't know he's there. His papers were scattered. Some were published in various collected editions. Others disappeared into private collections. Scholars still discover new Burke letters in archives and country houses. Each one adds detail to our understanding of his life, but the basic outline has been clear for 2 centuries. The man who'd been born in Dublin to modest circumstances, who'd come to London as a young writer seeking his fortune, who'd built a political career through brilliance and determination, who'd opposed a king, defended an empire, and predicted a revolution's horrors, died nearly forgotten and heavily in debt. He'd been famous, influential, respected, but he'd never been secure. He'd never quite belonged. Perhaps that's why he understood so deeply the importance of belonging. The outsider who'd spent his life trying to join the establishment had learned what insiders took for granted. Society wasn't just a collection of individuals making contracts. It was a web of relationships, traditions, unspoken understandings. You couldn't reduce it to principles. You couldn't redesign it according to theory. You had to live it, inherit it, pass it on. Burke's grave is simple. No grand monument, no elaborate epitaph, just a stone marking where he lies. The church is quiet, rarely visited except by locals on Sundays. The village of Beaconsfield has grown into a town, then a commuter suburb. The world Burke knew has vanished completely, but the questions he asked haven't. Every generation faces the choice between reform and revolution, between preserving and transforming, between trusting tradition and embracing change. Every generation has to decide how much of the past to keep and how much to discard. Every generation learns, often painfully, that Burke's warnings about the limits of human wisdom remain relevant. The French Revolution continued without him. The terror he'd predicted came in 1793. The guillotine worked daily. Robespierre fell. Napoleon rose. The war Burke had dreaded spread across Europe. Nothing he'd said made any difference to the course of events, but everything he'd said shaped how people understood those events. When the revolution turned violent, Burke's reflections suddenly looked prophetic. People who'd dismissed him as a hysterical reactionary began rereading his warnings. When Napoleon crowned himself emperor, proving that revolution leads to tyranny, Burke's analysis seemed vindicated. When the restored monarchy in France tried to pretend the revolution had never happened, Burke's argument that you can't simply go backward became obvious. His influence grew after his death in ways it never had during his life. The Reflections became a founding text of conservatism, the book that defined what it meant to oppose radical change. Political parties across Europe adopted Burke's arguments. Reformers who wanted gradual change rather than revolution quoted him. Even radicals who disagreed with his conclusions had to reckon with his reasoning. The irony is that Burke himself resisted simple categorization. He'd supported American independence, a revolutionary cause. He'd attacked British policy in India, challenging established imperial practice. He'd defended religious minorities, opposing the Anglican establishment. He'd championed economic reform, attacking corruption and waste. By modern standards, these were liberal positions. Yet he's remembered as conservatism's founder. What unified these seemingly contradictory positions was method, not ideology. Burke always started with existing institutions and relationships. He asked how they actually worked, what purposes they served, what would happen if you changed them. He was suspicious of abstract principles applied without regard to circumstances. He trusted experience over theory, gradual adjustment over radical redesign. This approach doesn't fit neatly into modern political categories. It's not about left versus right, progressive versus conservative. It's about how you think about change itself. Do you trust human reason to redesign society? Or do you trust the accumulated wisdom embedded in traditions? Burke's answer was clear. Trust tradition, not blindly, not absolutely. But when in doubt, assume that long-standing practices exist for reasons you might not fully understand. Reform them carefully. Test changes against reality. Don't assume you're smarter than your ancestors. This sounds conservative, and it is, but it's a specific kind of conservatism. Burke wasn't defending privilege or inequality or injustice, he was defending complexity. He was arguing that society is more intricate than any individual or group can fully comprehend, that institutions evolved over time contain knowledge that exceeds any single generation's understanding, that we should be humble about our ability to improve on what we've inherited. The 20th century tested Burke's ideas brutally. Communism tried to redesign society according to rational principles. Millions died. Fascism tried to impose order through state power. More millions died. Liberal democracy, which preserved much of the institutional inheritance Burke valued while reforming it gradually, survived and spread. This doesn't prove Burke was right about everything. His defense of aristocracy was wrong. His opposition to expanding the franchise was wrong. His faith in the British Constitution was often misplaced. But his core insight about the limits of human understanding and the value of institutional continuity has held up remarkably well. Modern conservatives claim him as their founder. Modern liberals cite him when arguing for pragmatic reform over ideological purity. Scholars debate whether he was really conservative at all, or whether that term does violence to his nuanced positions. Everyone reads him differently. Everyone finds different things in his work. Perhaps that's appropriate. Burke wasn't a system builder. He didn't create a comprehensive political philosophy with clear principles and logical deductions. He was a practical thinker, responding to specific situations, always attending to detail, always aware of complexity, always suspicious of simplification. His legacy isn't a set of doctrines. It's an approach, a way of thinking about politics that starts with humility about what we can know and caution about what we can control, a recognition that wisdom is often inherited rather than invented, an insistence that theory must always be tested against reality. This approach has critics. They argue that Burke's emphasis on tradition simply defends the status quo, that his suspicion of change protects existing power structures, that his humility before complexity is really just an excuse for inaction. Sometimes they're right. Burke's ideas can be used to justify complacency, to resist necessary reforms, to preserve injustice. But the alternative has proven dangerous too. The 20th century showed what happens when revolutionaries decide they understand society well enough to rebuild it from scratch. The confidence Burke warned against, the belief that human reason can redesign the social order, produced catastrophes on an unprecedented scale. We're still trying to find the balance Burke identified between reform and revolution, between preserving what works and changing what doesn't, between respecting tradition and adapting to new circumstances, between trusting inherited wisdom and thinking for ourselves. The questions remain urgent. How much can we know about complex social systems? How confident should we be in our ability to improve them? When is tradition worth preserving? When does it need to be overthrown? How do we distinguish between wisdom embedded in long-standing practices and mere habit or prejudice? Burke didn't answer these questions once and for all, but he taught us how to think about them. He showed us the dangers of excessive confidence in human reason. He reminded us that societies are more complex than any individual mind can grasp. He argued that we should approach social change with caution, testing reforms carefully, preserving what we don't fully understand. These lessons matter because we keep forgetting them. Every generation produces thinkers who believe they figured out how society should work, who want to sweep away the old and build something new according to their blueprint. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes necessary reforms can't happen without confronting entrenched interests. But often they're wrong. Often their confidence exceeds their understanding. Burke's voice across 2 centuries reminds us of this danger, not to prevent change, but to make it thoughtful. Not to worship the past, but to learn from it. Not to preserve everything, but to understand what we're losing before we discard it. The man himself was flawed. He was vain, ambitious, often petty in his political disputes. He held positions we now recognise as wrong. He defended aspects of the British system that deserved criticism. He sometimes let his rhetoric outrun his judgment. He was human, with all that implies, but he was also brilliant. His understanding of how societies actually work, as opposed to how they work in theory, remains unsurpassed. His ability to see consequences that others missed, to predict how noble intentions could lead to terrible outcomes, to recognise complexity where others saw simplicity. These gifts produced insights that outlasted their immediate context. The Reflections on the Revolution in France remains readable more than 2 centuries later. Not because it's always right, it isn't. Not because its specific predictions about France all came true, they didn't. But because it raises questions that every generation must answer. About the limits of human knowledge, about the value of tradition, about how we should approach change in complex systems we don't fully understand. Burke's other writings repay study too. His speeches on America show how principle and prudence can work together. His writings on India demonstrate that conservatism doesn't mean defending the powerful against the weak. His economic pamphlets reveal a thinker who understood markets and institutions in ways that modern economists still find valuable, but it's the Reflections that secured his immortality. That single book, written in white heat during a few months in 1790, defined an entire political tradition. It gave conservatism its intellectual foundation. It created a framework for thinking about social change that remains relevant today. The ideas spread slowly at first, then with gathering force. By the mid-19th century, Burke was being studied in universities, quoted in parliaments, cited by politicians across the political spectrum. By the 20th century, his influence was so pervasive that people absorbed his ideas without knowing their source. Today, when we talk about unintended consequences, we're echoing Burke. When we emphasize the importance of civil society and intermediate institutions, we're following Burke. When we warn against utopian schemes and revolutionary enthusiasm, we're channeling Burke. When we argue for gradual reform over radical transformation, we're applying Burke's method. He changed how we think about politics. Before Burke, political philosophy focused on abstract principles and ideal states. After Burke, it had to reckon with history, tradition, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Before Burke, reform and revolution seemed like variations on the same theme. After Burke, we understood them as fundamentally different approaches to change. His warning about the French Revolution echoes through time. Every revolutionary movement since has faced the question Burke posed. How do you avoid the terror? How do you prevent noble ideals from producing terrible outcomes? How do you rebuild society without destroying what makes it work? The answers vary, but the question remains. Burke made it impossible to think about political change without confronting this problem. He showed that good intentions aren't enough, that abstract principles can lead to concrete horrors, that the complexity of human society exceeds our ability to redesign it. This doesn't mean change is impossible or undesirable. Burke himself championed many reforms, but it means change should be approached with humility, tested against reality, adjusted based on results. It means we should preserve what we don't fully understand until we're certain we can replace it with something better. The 20th century proved him right more often than his critics would like to admit. The great ideological experiments in social engineering, whether communist or fascist, produced misery on a scale Burke's most dire warnings couldn't have imagined. The societies that preserved institutional continuity while reforming gradually, the approach Burke advocated, generally did better. This isn't a complete vindication. Burke's specific positions were often wrong. His general approach has proven valuable. The distinction matters. We can learn from his method without accepting all his conclusions. That's perhaps his final lesson. Political wisdom isn't about having the right answers to every question. It's about approaching questions in the right way, with humility about what we can know, with respect for what we've inherited, with caution about what we change, with attention to complexity and particularity rather than abstract principle. Burke embodied this approach. He thought about specific situations, specific institutions, specific consequences. He resisted simplification. He attended to detail. He recognized that different circumstances required different responses. He never built a complete system because he didn't believe complete systems were possible. This makes him difficult to categorize, but easy to use. Every political tradition finds something valuable in Burke. Conservatives cite his defense of tradition. Liberals cite his support for reform. Pragmatists cite his attention to consequences. Everyone can learn from his method, even when they disagree with his conclusions. The man who never held high office, who died in debt and disappointment, who saw his greatest warnings ignored in his lifetime, became one of the most influential political thinkers in history. Not through a comprehensive system, but through a way of thinking. Not through abstract principles, but through concrete analysis. Not through ideological consistency, but through practical wisdom. Burke's shadow stretches across modern politics. Every debate about reform versus revolution, tradition versus progress, preservation versus transformation takes place on ground he mapped. We may disagree with his specific positions, but we can't escape his fundamental questions. How much can we know? How much should we change? What are we risking when we discard tradition? What are we preserving when we defend it? These questions have no final answers. Each generation must work them out anew. But Burke gave us a framework for thinking about them, a vocabulary for discussing them, a set of warnings about the dangers of excessive confidence in human reason. That gift remains as valuable today as it was when he first offered it, watching France descend into chaos and trying to explain to his countrymen what was happening and why. His grave at Beaconsfield tells you everything you need to know about what Burke valued. No Westminster Abbey, no state funeral, no monument that would outlast the ages. Just a simple stone in a country church, marking where he lies next to Richard, the son whose death broke him. The world moved on quickly. Within a decade, most people had forgotten the speeches, the impeachment, the warnings about France. New crises demanded attention. New thinkers offered new solutions. Burke became a name in history books, referenced but not really read, cited but not understood. Yet something persisted: his method, his way of approaching political questions, the instinct to look at how things actually work rather than how they should work in theory, the suspicion of grand schemes and abstract principles, the recognition that societies are more complex than any individual can fully grasp. You see it in unexpected places. When economists talk about emergent order, they're echoing Burke even if they've never read him. When reformers emphasize gradualism and testing, they're following his path. When critics warn about revolutionary movements and utopian projects, they're channeling his skepticism. The ideas survived because they addressed something permanent. Every generation faces the tension between stability and change. Every society must decide what to preserve and what to transform. Every reform movement must answer Burke's challenge about unintended consequences and the limits of human understanding. He never resolved these tensions. He couldn't. They're not problems that can be solved, only managed. Different circumstances require different balances. What works in one time or place might fail in another. Burke knew this. That's why he never built a complete system, never offered a final theory, never claimed to have all the answers. What he offered instead was caution, not paralysis, not blind defense of the status quo, but thoughtful attention to complexity, respect for what we don't fully understand, humility about our ability to redesign society according to rational principles. This makes him hard to claim. Conservatives try. Liberals push back. Everyone reads him differently because he contained contradictions he never fully resolved. The man who defended American rebels and opposed French revolutionaries, who attacked the East India Company and defended the British Constitution, who championed reform and feared revolution. Perhaps the contradictions were the point. Real politics doesn't offer clean choices between good and evil, progress and reaction. It offers complicated situations where every option has costs, where wisdom means attending to particulars rather than applying universal principles, where the right answer depends on circumstances that can't be reduced to theory. Burke understood this in his bones. He'd lived it. The Irish outsider trying to join the English establishment, the brilliant speaker who never held real power, the reformer who became conservatism's founder, the man whose greatest warnings were ignored until events proved him right, by which time it was too late to matter. The final irony is that Burke spent his life defending tradition against abstract theory, yet he created a tradition of his own, a way of thinking about politics that emphasized prescription, prudence, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. This tradition wasn't handed down from the past. Burke invented it, drawing on sources as diverse as classical philosophy, English common law, and his own experience navigating Irish and English politics. He built a tradition to defend tradition. He used reason to argue for the limits of reason. He wrote brilliant theoretical works explaining why theory was dangerous. The paradoxes multiply the more you examine them. Maybe that's appropriate. Politics itself is paradoxical, requiring both principle and flexibility, both conviction and compromise, both standing firm and knowing when to bend. What remains, after all the debates and reinterpretations, is a voice across centuries asking questions we still need to answer. Not providing answers, Burke was too wise for that, but asking questions about how much we can know, about what we risk when we destroy institutions we don't fully understand, about the difference between reform and revolution, between preserving what works and changing what doesn't. The questions won't go away because the underlying problem won't go away. Societies must change to survive, but change always carries risk. We must reform institutions that have grown corrupt, but reform can destroy what we meant to save. We need the wisdom of the past, but we can't be imprisoned by it. The balance shifts constantly, and each generation must find it anew. Burke won't tell you where that balance lies. He'll just remind you it's there, that finding it requires attention to detail rather than adherence to principle. That wisdom means recognizing complexity rather than imposing simplicity. This frustrates people who want clear answers, but clear answers to complicated questions are usually wrong. The man who wrote the Reflections, who predicted the terror, who warned against revolutionary enthusiasm, who defended prescription and tradition, who championed reform and opposed tyranny, who spent 14 years prosecuting Warren Hastings and died believing he'd failed at everything that mattered. That man left behind not a system, but a sensibility, a way of approaching political questions that remains valuable precisely because it resists codification. You can't reduce Burke to a set of principles and apply them mechanically. You have to engage with his method, his attention to circumstance, his respect for complexity. You have to think the way he thought, not just adopt his conclusions. This makes him difficult, but rewarding. Every generation rediscovers him and finds something different, because every generation faces different challenges. The challenges change, but the underlying questions persist. That's why Burke matters, not because he gave us answers, but because he taught us how to think about problems that have no final solutions, how to approach change with appropriate caution, how to preserve what we don't fully understand while reforming what needs fixing, how to balance competing goods that can't all be maximized simultaneously. These lessons sound abstract until you need them. Then they become urgent. When revolutionary movements promise to remake society, Burke's warnings about unintended consequences suddenly seem relevant. When reformers push for rapid change, his emphasis on gradualism makes sense. When ideologues offer simple solutions to complex problems, his insistence on attending to particulars provides a necessary corrective. He won't tell you what to do. He'll just make you think harder about whatever you were planning. That's his gift and his curse. A voice of caution in every generation, reminding us that we're probably not as smart as we think we are, that our ancestors might have known something we've forgotten, that complexity exceeds comprehension. The conservative tradition he founded has often forgotten this. It's become ideological in ways Burke would have hated, defending the powerful against the weak, resisting necessary change, treating his insights as dogma rather than method. He'd be appalled. The whole point was to avoid ideology, to think concretely about specific situations, to recognize that different circumstances require different responses. But traditions, once established, take on lives of their own. They become what later generations make of them, not what their founders intended. Burke understood this too. He wrote about how institutions evolve, how practices change meaning over time, how the living must interpret what they've inherited rather than simply repeating it. So perhaps it's fitting that Burke's legacy has been contested, reinterpreted, claimed by different movements at different times. He'd have expected nothing less. Ideas like institutions must adapt to survive. The question isn't whether we're being faithful to what Burke actually believed. The question is whether we're thinking in ways he'd recognise, attending to complexity and consequence, respecting what we don't understand while fixing what we must. That standard is harder to meet than simple adherence to doctrine. It requires judgment rather than obedience, wisdom rather than cleverness, humility rather than confidence. Burke embodied these qualities imperfectly. He was often wrong, sometimes petty, occasionally blind to his own contradictions, but he showed what political thinking could be when it took complexity seriously, when it started with reality rather than theory, when it recognized the limits of human understanding. The man is gone. The world he knew has vanished. The specific crises he addressed have been superseded by new ones, but the fundamental challenge remains. How do we change what must be changed while preserving what we don't fully understand? How do we reform institutions without destroying them? How do we progress without forgetting what our ancestors learned? These questions define politics in every generation. Burke won't answer them for us, but he'll make us ask them better. He'll make us think harder about what we're doing and why. He'll remind us that confidence in human reason must be tempered by awareness of human fallibility. These reminders never go out of style because the temptation to forget them never disappears. That's his legacy, not a system or doctrine or set of policies, a sensibility, a way of approaching political questions that emphasizes caution without demanding paralysis, values tradition without worshipping it, seeks reform without embracing revolution. This sensibility shaped the modern world more than most people realise. It made possible the kind of gradual progress that preserves continuity while enabling change. The alternatives have proven worse. Revolutionary transformation produces chaos. Reactionary resistance produces explosion. Burke's middle path, reforming within tradition while respecting what we inherit, remains the only sustainable approach to political change. We keep forgetting this. We keep learning it again. Each generation has to discover anew what Burke spent his life trying to teach. He'd have expected that too. Wisdom can't be inherited. It must be earned through experience. Each generation makes its own mistakes, learns its own lessons, finds its own balance between preservation and transformation. Burke's writings help, but they're no substitute for actual political judgment applied to actual circumstances. That's the final lesson. There are no shortcuts, no formulas, no theories that can replace the hard work of attending to particular situations in all their complexity. Burke knew this. He lived it. He spent his career responding to specific problems rather than building abstract systems. His greatness lies in that response, in the quality of attention he brought to each crisis, in the depth of understanding he achieved through engagement rather than detachment. The monument isn't in Westminster Abbey. It's in the arguments we still have, the questions we still ask, the caution we sometimes remember to exercise when confronting problems that exceed our understanding. Burke planted those seeds. They've grown in ways he couldn't have predicted. They'll continue growing long after we're gone, because the problems he addressed are permanent features of political life. Every generation needs its Burke. Someone to ask awkward questions, someone to point out complexity where others see simplicity, someone to warn about unintended consequences, someone to defend what we don't fully understand against those who are certain they can build something better. The role is never popular. Burke discovered that, but it's necessary. He played it for 40 years. He lost most of his battles. He died disappointed and in debt. But he won something more important than any particular political fight. He changed how we think about politics itself. He showed us questions we didn't know we needed to ask. He revealed complexity we'd been ignoring. He taught us humility in the face of problems that exceed individual comprehension. That's enough. More than enough. The rest is detail, the particular positions and specific fights that mattered intensely in their moment and fade into history. What persists is the method, the approach, the sensibility, the voice asking us to think harder, to look more carefully, to recognise what we don't know before we act on what we think we do. Burke's voice, still speaking across the centuries, still relevant, still necessary, still asking the questions we need to answer, even when we'd rather not hear them.